I still remember the year it happened, even though I try hard to push it from my mind. It was 1997, late autumn, when the air turned sharp and dry in northern Minnesota. I was 28 at the time, and I had gone up to my grandfather's old hunting cabin for the weekend. He had passed away 3 years earlier, leaving the cabin and the surrounding patch of land in the family, but no one really used it anymore. My father had little interest in it, and my uncles lived too far away. I took it upon myself to keep the place from rotting away completely, checking on it once or twice a year. The cabin sat about 6 miles from the nearest town, down a dirt road that wasn't maintained much past summer. By late autumn, the road became rough with deep ruts from rain and early frost. The truck jolted around as I drove in, and when I finally reached the familiar clearing, I felt that same uneasy quiet that always lingered around the cabin. It wasn't that anything bad had ever happened there before, but the isolation gave me a knot in the stomach every time. The cabin was small, 1 story, built of old pine logs that had weathered to a grayish brown. The roof sagged a little in the middle, and the porch steps creaked loud enough to startle birds when I tested them. Inside, the air smelled of mildew, old wood, and a faint sourness from mice that had nested somewhere between the walls. Dust coated everything, even though I had swept it the last time I was there. I had brought my dog with me, a mixed shepherd named Duke. He was always restless when we came out to the cabin, pacing and sniffing more than usual, but I trusted his instincts more than my own. He was already sniffing along the porch before I unlocked the door, and when I stepped inside, he stayed close behind me instead of charging ahead the way he usually did. That struck me as odd. The first day passed slow. I did the usual, checked the roof for leaks, patched up a window with plastic where the cold air was getting in, swept mouse droppings from the floor. I made a small fire in the old iron stove, cooked some canned chili, and settled in with a lantern. The night outside was black as tar. No moon, no light except the orange glow from the stove through the cracks in the walls. Duke lay at my feet, occasionally lifting his head to stare at the door. I listened to the wind shifting in the trees and tried not to think about how alone I was. It was the second day when I found it. I woke early to the cold, breath visible in the dim cabin air. After some coffee on the stove, I took Duke outside to walk him through the trees. The ground was crunchy with frost, and the leaves had mostly fallen, leaving the woods bare and full of long shadows. We walked toward the small shed that stood behind the cabin, about 50 yards back. It was a place my grandfather used to keep tools, old traps, and spare lumber. The door to the shed hung crooked, the lock rusted away years ago. Duke stopped short as we approached, ears forward, hackles raised. He gave a low growl, something he rarely did. I stepped closer, and that's when the smell hit me. It was sharp, sour, heavy in my throat. A smell I recognized from dead animals in the woods, but far stronger, deeper. I pushed the door open, and the beam of my flashlight cut across the dark interior. At first, it was just junk. Old rakes, coils of wire, a broken chair. Then my light froze on a shape against the back wall. For a moment, I couldn't process it. It looked like a pile of clothing, slumped in the corner. But as I stepped closer, the shape took form, and there was no mistaking it. A body. It was a man, slumped half on his side, knees drawn up. His skin was gray and tight, his face turned toward the wall. His clothes were stained and torn, but what stood out most was the way his hands were curled in toward his chest, stiff and claw-like. The smell was overpowering. Duke barked and backed out of the shed, pulling at the leash, whining high in his throat. My stomach dropped so hard I nearly fell. I staggered out of the shed, gulping the cold air. I couldn't even think straight. My mind raced with questions. Who was he? How long had he been there? Why in my grandfather's shed? I didn't know whether to run for the truck or go back inside and look for some kind of clue. My body felt both frozen and on fire. I forced myself back to the shed. I didn't want to, but I had to see. The man looked maybe in his 30s, hard to tell with the decay. His clothes were plain, dark jeans, flannel shirt, heavy boots. No jacket. I didn't see any obvious wound, but I couldn't make myself get too close. The shed was cold, but not cold enough to stop decomposition. He must have been there for weeks at least. I backed out again, shaking. My grandfather had been gone 3 years, but this shed had been locked and untouched for longer than that. I thought about the last time I was at the cabin, spring earlier that year, and how I hadn't even looked inside. The idea that this body could have been lying there all summer made me sick. I knew I needed to call the sheriff's department. The problem was, there was no phone in the cabin, no cell service in that part of the woods back then. I had to drive into town. The thought of leaving the body behind made me uneasy, but what else could I do? Back inside the cabin, I gathered my things quickly, hands trembling so bad I dropped the lantern. Duke paced by the door, restless, sensing my panic. I kept looking out the windows, though I didn't know what I expected to see. The woods were still, but I couldn't shake the thought that maybe whoever had left that man there wasn't far away. The drive back was the longest 6 miles I've ever done. Every rut in the road made me think I'd lose control of the truck. My eyes scanned the trees, expecting movement, but there was nothing but the bare branches clawing the sky. Duke sat rigid in the seat beside me, silent. When I reached town, I went straight to the sheriff's office. The words came out in a rush, almost incoherent, but they understood quickly enough. They drove back with me, 2 deputies and the sheriff himself. When we reached the cabin again, the light was fading. They went into the shed with flashlights and masks, while I stayed by the truck with Duke. I heard one of them curse low under his breath when they saw the body. The investigation went on for weeks after that. They asked me 100 questions, checked my alibis, searched the cabin and the land. Eventually, they identified the man. His name was Robert Keller, 34, from a town nearly 80 miles away. He had a history of drug problems and minor theft, and he'd gone missing late that summer. They never figured out exactly how he ended up in my grandfather's shed. There were no bullet wounds, no signs of stabbing. The medical examiner said it looked like exposure, maybe drugs in his system, maybe both. But how he got all the way out there, why he crawled into that shed, why no one came looking sooner, they never gave me an answer that made sense. The cabin never felt the same after that. I went back once, the next spring, to try to fix the porch, but every time I walked near the shed, I felt sick all over again. The smell was gone, the body removed, but the memory stayed sharp. Duke wouldn't go near it at all, pulling on the leash to stay back. By the end of that year, I stopped going altogether. The land still belongs to the family, but the cabin is slowly collapsing now. Roof caving in, porch swallowed by weeds. Sometimes I think about tearing it down just to erase the place from my mind, but I've never brought myself to do it. That weekend changed how I look at the woods, at cabins, at isolation itself. Before, the cabin had always been just a quiet, lonely place. After finding that body, I learned that loneliness doesn't mean safety. Sometimes people go missing, sometimes they end up in the most unexpected places, and sometimes the answers never come. That's the part that stays with me. Not the sight of him, not even the smell, but the silence that followed. A silence that never gave me any real explanation. Only questions that will stay with me for the rest of my life. I was 34 years old the year I decided to take a week off work and drive north into the woods for some hunting and quiet. It was late October of 1997. The air already sharp with cold, the kind that made your nose sting after only a few minutes outside. A friend of mine had an old hunting cabin sitting about 6 miles from the nearest gravel road in upstate Maine. He hadn't been up there for a couple of years and told me I could use it if I wanted. I had been needing space to clear my head, so I packed up my rifle, some food, a lantern, and a stack of firewood I'd picked up from the hardware store, then drove out before dawn. The road into the woods was rougher than I remembered. My truck bounced over potholes, tires crunching against scattered stones. By the time I reached the narrow turnoff that led deeper into the forest, the sun was already low, and the sky looked like brushed steel. The cabin sat another hour's hike in, so I left the truck parked beneath a stand of pines and hauled my gear on foot. The cabin wasn't much to look at. A one-room box with a tin roof that looked like it could barely hold against a strong wind. But the door was still tight, the small windows unbroken, and the old chimney stood straight. Inside, it smelled of dry pine, stale smoke, and mouse droppings. I set my things down, swept the floor with a broom I found leaning in a corner, and got a fire going in the cast iron stove. By the time the light outside faded, the room glowed with orange warmth, and the woods outside pressed against the glass like a wall of black. That night I couldn't sleep. The silence was too thick, broken only by the occasional pop from the stove. Every creak in the wood frame sounded louder in my ears. I kept telling myself it was just my nerves adjusting to being so far out, but the unease clung to me. I must have dozed off around 2 in the morning, rifle leaning against the wall next to the cot, boots still half-laced on my feet. The next morning, frost clung to the grass outside. I strapped on my gear and headed into the trees, rifle slung over my shoulder. I saw a few tracks, a set of deer prints near a stream, fresher than I expected this late in the season. I followed them for a while but lost them near a thicket of deadfall. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No birds, no squirrels, just the crunch of my boots on the leaves. Around midday, I turned back toward the cabin, the sky clouding over like it was holding back snow. When I reached the clearing, something felt wrong immediately. The door to the cabin was slightly open. I knew for certain I had pulled it shut before leaving. My chest tightened. I waited, listening, but heard nothing. Carefully, I pushed inside. The fire was dead cold, but what caught me was the boot print across the dusty floorboards. It wasn't mine. Too wide, too flat, and it had been pressed hard, leaving a deep mark. I checked my supplies. Nothing obvious was missing, food still there, rifle still against the wall. But my backpack had been shifted. The zipper was half open. Someone had gone through it. I walked the cabin twice, forcing myself to breathe evenly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had stepped inside might still be nearby, maybe watching from the tree line. That night, I barred the door with a chair and kept the rifle across my lap. Sleep never really came. Every snap of a branch outside, every groan of wood, had me on edge. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps crunching lightly over leaves, circling the cabin. I held my breath, finger on the trigger, until the noise stopped. When dawn finally came, I felt like my skin had been stretched too thin. On the third day, I went out again, but I didn't make it far. About 50 yards from the cabin, I saw another set of prints in the frost, fresh ones. They circled the clearing, looping in uneven arcs, sometimes close to the door, sometimes farther back toward the trees. They weren't mine. The boots had a tread I didn't recognize, the pattern more like work boots than hiking. I crouched low, my stomach twisting. Whoever it was had been out there in the dark, close enough to touch the walls. I went back inside and spent the day listening. The hours dragged on. Around noon, I thought I caught movement between the trees, a flicker of dark fabric against the pale bark. But when I raised my rifle, the space was empty. By evening, the wind picked up, rattling the tin roof. I set another heavy log in the stove and tried to convince myself to stay calm. But the truth was, I felt trapped. On the fourth night, it got worse. I woke to the sound of something scraping along the outside wall. Slow, deliberate drags like metal against wood. My hands were shaking as I held the rifle. I stayed absolutely still, listening as the sound moved from one side of the cabin to the other. Then silence. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would give me away. Hours passed before light bled into the sky again. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay. Whoever was out there wasn't just passing through. They knew I was inside, and they wanted me to know they were there. I packed quickly, stuffing only what I could carry. The firewood, the extra cans of food, I left it all. When I stepped outside, the frost glittered across the clearing, and that's when I saw them. More prints, dozens of them, leading up to the cabin, around it, away from it. Some overlapping, some heading deeper into the woods. The sight made my stomach drop. This wasn't one person. It had been more than one all along. I tightened the straps of my pack and headed for the truck, rifle in my hands. The woods felt alive around me, branches swaying though there was barely wind. I kept looking over my shoulder, certain I would see someone step out from behind a tree. Every sound, every crack of ice, every distant thud sent my nerves spiking. The walk that had taken me an hour coming in felt endless going out. When I finally saw the glint of my truck through the trees, relief hit me like a wave. But the relief broke apart the moment I noticed the driver's side door. It hung open, swinging slightly. My gut clenched. I hadn't left it that way. I forced myself forward, checking the back seat, the bed, the tree-lean. No one in sight, but the glove box was open, papers scattered across the floorboard. I didn't waste a second. I climbed in, slammed the door shut, and locked it. The engine coughed to life, louder than it had ever sounded before, and I floored it down that gravel road, tires spitting rocks. I kept glancing in the mirror the whole way out, expecting to see figures step into the road behind me. But there was nothing, just trees thinning into fields, fields fading into the edge of town. By the time I reached the highway, the sun was high, and the normal world moved around me. Cars, gas stations, people going about their day as if nothing was wrong. I pulled over at a rest stop, hands trembling against the steering wheel. I sat there for almost an hour before I could make myself drive again. I never went back to that cabin. I told my friend he should burn it down, but I don't know if he ever did. All I know is someone, or more than one, was out there in those woods watching, waiting, and walking circles around me while I slept. And I wasn't about to give them another chance. It was late autumn of 1997 when I ended up in a place I had no reason to be. I had been driving through the countryside in Northumberland, heading back from a short job in Scotland, when my old Ford broke down. The timing chain had started rattling hours before, but I had ignored it, hoping I'd make it back home. By the time the sun dipped low and the fields turned dark, the engine finally gave out and left me stranded near a stretch of winding back roads I didn't recognize. The nearest village had been miles back. I knew because I hadn't seen a single lit window for almost half an hour. I pulled the car to the side and tried to make a call on the bulky mobile I carried, but there was no signal. The only option was to walk and look for shelter until morning. I packed my small bag with a torch, a flask of water, and a couple of protein bars, then started walking down the road. The air smelled damp, like wet leaves and soil, and every step echoed louder than it should have in the empty countryside. After about 20 minutes of walking, I noticed a rusted gate partly hidden by overgrown hedges. Behind it was an old sign too weathered to read, hanging crooked on one chain. When I shone my torch past the gate, I saw rows of leaning stones scattered across a wide plot of land. It was a graveyard, though most of the markers were crumbling and swallowed by weeds. Beyond the stones, tucked near the tree-lean, stood a cabin. It wasn't large, maybe one story with a pitched roof and a chimney that had collapsed in on one side. The windows were black squares, and the door hung unevenly on its frame. I didn't want to step inside that graveyard. Something about it made my stomach feel heavy. But the thought of sleeping on the cold roadside in November was worse. I pushed the gate until it groaned open and walked through, crunching dead leaves beneath my boots. The graves were old, some so sunken I nearly tripped. The names on the stones had been washed out by decades of rain, and the few words I could make out were dates from the late 1800s. The silence pressed in on me. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of wind in the trees. My torch flickered once, which sent a jolt through my chest, but it stayed on. The cabin smelled of mildew the second I pushed the door open. The hinges squealed, and the wood scraped the floor as if it hadn't been moved in years. Inside, the air was thick with damp rot. Dust floated in the beam of my light. There was a small table against the wall, a broken chair tipped on its side, and what looked like an old iron stove in the corner. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and I noticed holes where mice had chewed through the edges. I set my bag down and checked the back of the cabin. There was one other room, no bigger than a closet, with a collapsed bed frame and a pile of old fabric that might once have been a mattress. The smell in there was worse, sharp and sour, like something had been left to rot long ago. I didn't linger. I decided to stay in the main room and unrolled my thin blanket on the floor near the stove. My plan was to rest for a few hours until daylight, then head out to find a proper road or someone who could give me a lift. I tried to settle, but my nerves kept me wide awake. Every creak in the cabin felt exaggerated, like the wood was straining under something heavier than me. At one point, I thought I heard shuffling outside, the soft drag of feet across damp leaves. But when I turned off my torch and listened hard, the sound vanished. I dozed lightly, though it was the kind of half-sleep where your brain refuses to let go. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke with my heart hammering. The air felt colder, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees. I reached for my torch, flicked it on, and swept the beam across the room. That's when I saw its scratches. They were on the inside of the door, long, uneven lines dug into the wood, some high, some low, as if different hands had clawed at it over time. I hadn't noticed them when I entered. They weren't fresh, but the grooves were deep enough to catch the light. My skin prickled, and I had to look away. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Kids fooling around, or maybe the wood had warped and split. But when I lay back down, I couldn't stop staring at that door. Then I heard it again. The shuffling, this time closer, right outside the wall. Slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin. I sat up, holding the torch tight in my hand, and my throat went dry. There was no conversation, no voice, just that steady movement outside. I wanted to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, but the steps were too heavy, too slow. They stopped at the window. The glass was so grimy I couldn't see through it, but I knew something, or someone, was on the other side. I held my breath until my chest hurt. After a long silence, the steps moved again, around to the back of the cabin, then faded into nothing. I didn't sleep again. I sat against the wall until a thin gray light started to spread through the windows. My whole body ached from tension. As soon as the sun rose enough to see clearly, I grabbed my bag and pushed out the door. The graveyard looked different in the daylight. The stones cast long shadows, and the weeds swayed in a light breeze. I hurried through, not wanting to look too closely at anything. But just before I reached the gate, something caught my eye. Near the far corner of the graveyard, half buried in brambles, was a mound of disturbed earth. It didn't look old. The soil was darker than the rest, fresh-turned, as if someone had dug there not long ago. There was no headstone, no marker, just that patch of unsettled ground. My chest tightened, and every instinct told me to leave it alone. Still, my eyes locked on it, and the unease I felt the night before began to make more sense. Whoever had been moving around that cabin hadn't just been wandering. They had a reason to be there, a reason tied to that patch of earth. I forced myself through the gate and back onto the road. My legs moved fast, almost a jog, and I didn't stop until I was miles away. Eventually, I flagged down a lorry driver who gave me a lift into the nearest town, where I found a garage and sorted my car. I never mentioned the graveyard cabin to him or anyone else. Even now, years later, I can still picture those scratches on the door and that mound of dirt hidden in the corner. The cabin wasn't haunted. The graveyard wasn't cursed. It was worse than that. It was a place someone was using, someone who didn't want to be found, someone who had been close enough to stand outside the window while I lay inside, pretending to sleep. I realized the truth as I replayed everything. The sound of steps circling, the fresh soil, the scratches on the inside of the door. Those weren't old scratches from decades back. They were warnings or signs of someone who had been trapped there before. Whoever dug that grave might have been the same one who left them. I was lucky. Lucky my torch never died. Lucky I left at first light. Lucky I didn't go near that fresh mound. Because whatever had happened there wasn't finished. And if I had stayed longer, I might have been the next one buried in that corner of the graveyard. I had rented a small cabin on the edge of Northumberland in the United Kingdom during the autumn of 2017. I was 31 then, tired of the crowded city and the endless noise that followed me even when I tried to sleep. I wanted quiet. I wanted a break from the clatter of buses, the blaring horns, the walls that felt too thin in my flat. I found the place online, tucked away in the countryside near a stretch of woods that grew thick and damp with moss. It wasn't large, just 2 small rooms, but it had what I wanted. Seclusion, silence, and the kind of stillness that let me breathe without feeling like someone was watching from the next building over. The cabin was older than I thought when I first arrived. The wood panels outside were darkened with years of rain, and the roof sagged slightly toward one side. The glass windows were cloudy, as if they hadn't been cleaned in a long time, and the hinges of the door squealed each time I pushed it open. The inside had a smell that reminded me of damp stone and burned wood, something that clung to the air even when I left the windows open. I didn't mind, though. The place felt real, like it hadn't been polished to impress anyone. I liked that. The first night was quiet. I stayed up later than I should have, sitting on the small wooden chair near the fireplace and reading by the yellow glow of a lamp. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, steady and low. At some point, I realized I hadn't heard a single car since I'd arrived. That thought struck me as strange at first, but then I accepted it. I wasn't in the city anymore. Here the roads were miles apart, and the fields stretched further than my eyes could follow. It was supposed to be empty. The second night, I noticed something. It wasn't anything loud or sudden. It was a shape I caught when I looked through the window. The cabin sat on a slight hill, and through the thin curtains I could see a line of trees across the open field. The light of the moon was sharp, cutting down through the mist, and as I stood there, I thought I saw someone at the edge of the tree line. I froze, holding the curtain just enough to see out. It looked like a woman, thin, standing still, almost too still. She wore something pale, maybe a coat or a dress, but the distance was too far to tell. I thought I was imagining it, so I let the curtain fall and told myself it was nothing. But when I woke up the next morning, I checked the same spot. Nothing was there, only the trees, dark and dripping with dew. The grass shone with water, untouched. That day I went for a walk. The air was heavy, wet with the kind of cold that cuts through a jacket. The ground squelched under my boots, and the mud clung to me no matter where I stepped. I followed a thin path past the cabin and into the woods, and after a while I found a small stream. The place was silent except for the water. The silence made me uneasy. It was the kind of quiet where every step echoed too loud. where I could hear my own breathing as if it were foreign. By the time I returned, the light was already fading. I made myself tea, sat by the window, and tried to push the strange unease away. But that night, when I stepped outside for air, I saw her again, this time closer. She was standing in the open field, not by the trees, but halfway between the woods and the cabin. The moonlight showed her more clearly. I could see the outline of her arms hanging at her sides, her head tilted slightly forward. She didn't move. She didn't walk. She just stood there, facing my cabin. The air in my chest tightened. My mind raced with reasons. Maybe she was a neighbor, maybe she was lost, maybe I was simply tired and seeing wrong. I stepped back inside quickly and locked the door. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the cabin made me think of her outside, standing still, waiting. The following day, I tried to distract myself. I took out a notebook and scribbled thoughts, made food, even cleaned the small shelves though they were already bare. I avoided looking out the windows. I told myself it was all in my head. Yet the sense of being watched didn't leave me. Even in the middle of the day, when the sun pushed through the gray clouds, I felt it. The hairs on my arms stood up every time I passed by a window, and I caught myself glancing toward the field even when I didn't want to. By the fourth night, it was worse. I was sitting at the small table with the lamp on when I heard something outside. It wasn't the wind this time. It was softer, like the crunch of weight shifting on wet ground. I sat completely still, my heart slamming hard in my chest. Slowly, I turned off the lamp. The cabin went dark. I sat in the silence, listening. Another sound came, this time closer to the cabin. My throat dried. I moved to the window, pushing the curtain with the edge of my finger, and I saw her again. She was standing not more than 30 feet away, directly in front of the cabin. She wasn't moving, wasn't turning, wasn't doing anything but facing me. The pale coat or dress hung loose, stained at the bottom with mud. Her hair looked stringy, long, hanging forward enough to shadow most of her face. She didn't step closer, but I could see her shoulders rise slightly as if she were breathing slow and heavy. I backed away from the window, locked every door, every window, checked them twice. I didn't have a phone signal out here, and the landline was dead. The only road was too far to walk in the dark. I had no choice but to wait it out. That night dragged on longer than any I'd lived. I sat with my back against the wall, staring at the door, afraid of the sound of footsteps or the creak of wood. But she never came closer. She just stood there until the light of dawn began to break. When I looked again in the morning, she was gone. By then I knew I couldn't stay. The silence, the cabin, the empty field. It all pressed on me like a weight. I packed my bag, throwing things in without care, and by midday I was gone. I didn't look back when I locked the door behind me. I walked the path back to the small road where my car was parked and drove until the hills gave way to towns, until I saw people again. I never told anyone about it in detail. When friends asked why I cut the trip short, I just said the cabin wasn't what I expected. The truth stayed with me, though. I can still see her in my head, the way she stood motionless, the way the pale fabric clung to her in the moonlight, the way her presence turned the quiet countryside into something unbearable. To this day, I don't know who she was or why she stood there night after night. Maybe she was just someone who wandered too close, maybe someone not well in the head, maybe someone who had lived in that place long before me. All I know is that she was real and she watched me. That was enough. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. It was late September of 1996 when I decided to spend a few nights at the old farm cabin that had been in my family for decades. The cabin sat on the far edge of a property my uncle once used for crops, back when farming still paid him enough to get by. After he passed, the land was mostly left alone, overgrown with weeds and brush, and the cabin stood like a forgotten skeleton near the treeline. I was 29 that year, restless and tired of the city noise, and I thought a short escape into the quiet countryside would help clear my head. The cabin was nothing impressive. It was built in the late 50s by my grandfather, with rough timber walls and a tin roof that rattled every time wind moved through the fields. When I arrived, I parked my old pickup in the grass beside it and noticed how weathered it looked. The wood was gray and split, nails rusted, and part of the back wall sagged as if the earth beneath it had given up. The windows were streaked with dirt, one of them cracked. The front steps groaned when I put weight on them. Inside, it smelled of dust, dried mud, and something faintly metallic, like old tools left in the rain. The furniture was still in place from years back. A narrow bed frame with a thin mattress, a wood stove, a rocking chair, and a rough wooden table with 2 chairs. The floorboards were uneven, and in the corners I could see mouse droppings scattered like tiny black seeds. I swept the place with an old broom I found leaning near the door, stirred up a cloud of dust, and opened the windows to air it out. The farm around the cabin was silent in a way the city never was. No engines, no voices, no constant buzz of traffic. Only wind bending through dry cornstalks left from a failed crop, and the occasional cry of a crow overhead. At first, that quiet made me feel calm. I thought I'd spend the weekend writing in a notebook, fishing in the nearby creek, and just being away from people. That first night, I lit a lantern and cooked beans over the stove. The flame hissed softly, and I ate in silence, listening to the cabin groan in the wind. I lay down on the bed after and stared at the ceiling until my eyes grew heavy. Sleep came slow because every sound felt sharper out there. The scratching in the walls, the whistle of air through gaps in the boards, the distant creak of the barn's collapsed door swinging against its hinges. But eventually I drifted off. Around midnight, I woke to a noise that didn't fit. It wasn't the wind or the shifting wood. It was steady, muffled thuds, like heavy steps on dirt. I lay still, heart quick, straining to hear. They came from outside, moving around the cabin's side. I told myself it could be a deer or maybe stray cattle from a neighbor's property. But when I finally sat up and peered through the window, I didn't see anything. The grass moved slightly, and the cornstalks swayed, but there was no animal. The next morning, I walked around the cabin. The ground was soft from rain earlier that week, and I found impressions in the dirt along the wall. Not hooves, shoes. The prints were faint but clear enough to see the outline of boots. Someone had walked slowly, right up against the cabin in the dark. I felt my stomach tighten. The nearest neighbor was more than a mile away, and no one had reason to be out here in the middle of the night. I tried to brush it off. Maybe some hunter had wandered too far. Maybe kids messing around. But I couldn't get the image of those prints out of my mind. I decided to keep busy, clearing brush near the edge of the property and checking the old shed behind the barn. The shed was a mess of rusted farm tools, broken handles, and collapsed shelves. A sharp smell of old gasoline hung inside. I left it alone and went back before the sun dipped. That second night, I had trouble sleeping from the start. Every sound pressed against my nerves. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it again, the slow crunch of steps outside. I sat up fast, heart pounding, and listened. The steps stopped near the front of the cabin. Then I heard the faint scrape of metal against wood, like someone testing the door latch. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. After a long silence, the steps shifted again, moving toward the back until they faded into the distance. When dawn came, I checked the door. The latch was scratched, as if someone had dragged a blade across it, trying to pry it loose. My chest felt hollow as I stared at it. Whoever it was hadn't gone away. They wanted in. I thought about leaving, packing my bag and driving home, but stubbornness kept me there. It was my family's cabin. I didn't want to be chased out by some trespasser. That day, I found myself checking over my shoulder every few minutes. I kept the cabin door locked and even wedged a chair under the handle. My pickup sat right outside, but part of me felt like if I left, whoever was out there would know they had one. I carried a heavy wrench from the shed and kept it near the bed. The third night was worse. I barely slept. Around midnight, the sounds came again, but this time closer, bolder. I heard the crunch of boots on the porch, the long creak of the step under weight, and then the soft knock against the wall, like someone dragging their knuckles along the boards. I gripped the wrench tight, every muscle frozen, and waited for the door to give way. Minutes dragged on, then silence. I must have drifted into shallow sleep because I woke again just before dawn to the sound of my truck door shutting. Panic surged through me. I rushed to the window and saw nothing but the empty field, the gray light of morning, and my truck sitting just where I'd left it. I ran outside in bare feet and yanked open the driver's side door. The seat was wet with morning dew, but on the passenger seat lay something I hadn't left there. An old hunting knife, its blade dull and rusted, its handle wrapped in cracked leather. That was it for me. I tossed the knife into the weeds, ran back inside, packed my things in a rush, and didn't look back as I started the truck and drove down the dirt road as fast as the ruts would allow. I never went back to that cabin. A few years later, a storm finally brought the roof down, and the land was sold off. Sometimes I wonder who was out there those nights. Maybe a drifter, maybe someone who'd been watching the cabin for years, waiting for someone like me to show up. I'll never know. What I do know is that I was lucky. Lucky they didn't push harder. Lucky that knife was only left behind and not used. The quiet of the countryside that once felt peaceful now carries a different weight for me. When the wind moves through fields, when a floorboard groans in the night, I think of those steps outside my cabin door, circling, waiting. And I remind myself that silence doesn't always mean safety. Sometimes it means someone is already there, just beyond what you can see. I had never spent much time alone in the woods until that autumn. It was 2016, and I had just turned 31. I was going through one of those times in life where everything feels uncertain. My job in construction had slowed down, and I figured I'd get away for a while, clear my head. A friend of mine had mentioned an old hunting cabin up in northern Arizona, somewhere near the Mogollon Rim. He hadn't been there in years, but he said the cabin was still standing, empty, and I could use it if I wanted. That was all I needed. Solitude, quiet, no city noise, no people asking me what I was going to do next with my life. The drive up, there was long, mostly dirt roads cutting through thick pine forest. I got there in the late afternoon, sun dropping low enough to throw long shadows across the trees. The cabin was small, built from rough logs, with a sagging roof but still solid enough. There was no power, no plumbing, just a wood stove, a cot, and a couple shelves. Out behind it, maybe 50 yards back, there was a narrow game trail that disappeared into the woods. The first night felt peaceful. I lit a lantern, made some beans on the stove, and listened to the forest settle down. The sound of wind in the trees, the occasional crack of a branch far off, the chirp of night insects. It all made me feel like I was somewhere different from the life I'd been stuck in. I fell asleep quickly. It was the second night when things started to feel strange. I was sitting by the fire outside, just letting the flames die down, when I heard something off in the trees. It wasn't the usual rustle of animals. It was steady, slow, like deliberate footsteps. They came from the direction of that game trail behind the cabin. I sat up straighter, listening. For a while it stopped, and I figured maybe it was just a deer moving through. But then I caught the sound again, closer, and something about it unsettled me. The steps were too heavy, spaced out like a person walking. I told myself not to worry. People hiked through these woods, maybe even camped nearby. But as I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever was moving around out there was watching me. That night, I slept lighter. Every sound made me stir. At one point, I thought I heard something brush against the outside wall of the cabin. Not scratching, not banging, just a faint drag, like a hand or body sliding along the logs. I lay still in the cot, holding my breath until the sound stopped. Eventually, I drifted back off. The next morning, I walked around the cabin to check. In the dirt, just a few feet from the back wall, I saw prints. They weren't boots, and they weren't the neat hooves of deer. They looked like bare feet, but stretched, longer than normal, toes spread out deep into the soil. I bent down and touched one. The ground was still damp from the night, and the impression was fresh. That bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Who would walk barefoot out here in the cold? It had been in the 40s overnight. And why so close to the cabin? I tried to push it out of my head, spent the day chopping firewood, fixing up the shutters and hiking a bit, but I couldn't shake the thought of those prints. That evening, I kept the fire bigger, more for comfort than warmth. As the woods went dark, I stayed outside longer, watching, listening. Around midnight, I heard something again on the game trail. A shape moved between the trees. My lantern didn't throw light far, but I saw enough to know it wasn't a deer. It was standing upright. I froze, my heart hammering. The figure moved oddly, stiff, unbalanced, as if its joints didn't work quite right. It stopped when it reached a clearing where the moonlight cut through. For a few seconds, I could make out a human-like shape, tall, thin, head turned toward me. But there was something wrong with how it stood, how its arms hung too low, too loose. I couldn't make out the face, but I felt certain it was watching me. I grabbed my hatchet, even though I knew that wouldn't do much. I held it tight, staring back at the tree line. Then, as sudden as it appeared, the shape backed into the darkness and was gone. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I was exhausted and jumpy. I told myself maybe it was some drifter, someone strung out, wandering the woods. But deep down, I knew that shape wasn't moving like any normal person. Still, I tried to be rational. I packed up some food and went walking, circling wider around the cabin, trying to see if anyone was camped nearby. I found nothing, no tents, no trash, no boot prints. Only more of those strange, stretched out bare footprints, leading deeper into the forest. I should have left then, packed up, driven back down the dirt road, and put the whole thing behind me. But I didn't. Some stubborn part of me wanted to face it, to prove I wasn't losing my mind. That night, I barricaded the door with a heavy log and kept the lantern burning low. For hours, nothing happened, just the normal night sounds. But around 3 in the morning, I heard it again, slow footsteps circling the cabin. They crunched in the pine needles dragged across rocks. Then came the sound of breathing, heavy and uneven, right outside the wall where I lay. I held my breath, gripping the hatchet. The breathing shifted, moving from one side of the cabin to the other, slow, deliberate. At one point, I thought I heard a low sound, like someone trying to mimic a cough, but strained. Wrong. The footsteps lingered for what felt like an hour, then faded back toward the trail. By dawn, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my things fast, barely ate, and loaded the truck. Before leaving, I walked back to the game trail one last time. The dirt was torn up with tracks, dozens of them, circling and weaving like whoever made them had spent hours pacing around. Some prints were deep, as if whoever or whatever it was had crouched low, waiting. The drive out felt longer than coming in. Every shadow between the trees made me tense. When I finally hit pavement again, I felt like I'd been holding my breath for days. I never went back to that cabin. A few weeks later, I tried to look up old stories about the area. I found mentions from locals about strange figures in the woods, things that stalked campsites, shapes that looked human but weren't quite right. They called them skinwalkers. I don't know what I saw, and I don't care to find out. All I know is that for 3 nights in that old cabin, something was watching me, circling, getting closer. And if I'd stayed one more night, I don't think I'd have made it back out. Even now, years later, whenever I'm out in the woods and the night goes too quiet, I feel that same weight pressing on me. The sound of those stretched footsteps is burned into my memory, and I know I'll never forget it. I was 29 years old in the fall of 2014 when I decided to rent a small cabin tucked away in the northern woods of Michigan. I had been working in the city for too long, spending every day staring at a computer screen, and I wanted to feel what it was like to be far away from all of it. No neighbors, no traffic, just trees and silence. The cabin wasn't anything special, just a rough wooden place with 2 rooms and a small porch, but it was cheap and off the beaten path. I drove up there alone with my truck, loaded with some groceries, a sleeping bag, a lantern, and a couple of old tools I thought I might need. The drive itself was calm at first. I left the last stretch of paved road behind and bounced along miles of dirt tracks until the trees swallowed up everything around me. I didn't see another car, not even a mailbox, for nearly an hour before I reached the clearing where the cabin stood. It sat low against the tree-line, its roof slanting under years of weather, with tall weeds crawling up around the porch steps. The place looked lonely in a way I hadn't expected, like nobody had bothered to step foot there in months. When I first walked inside, the smell hit me right away. Old wood mixed with damp air, the kind of smell you get when windows stay shut too long. Dust lay across the table, and cobwebs gathered in the corners. The cabin wasn't large, but there was enough room for a bed, a small stove, and a couple of shelves. It felt like stepping back in time, away from everything I was used to. At first, it gave me a quiet kind of comfort. I unpacked slowly and tried to settle in. I spent that first day cutting some fallen branches to stack outside, checking the small stove, and walking the area around the cabin. It was nothing but trees in every direction, thick and close together, with the occasional sound of birds overhead. I felt safe enough, almost cut off from the rest of the world. But as the sun started to fall behind the trees, a strange uneasiness crept in. The woods didn't just get darker, they seemed to swallow sound. The birds went silent, and the breeze dropped until it was nothing but still air. I lit the lantern inside and tried to read, but I kept catching myself listening for something outside. Every crack of wood settling or rustle in the weeds made my nerves jolt. By the time I lay down, I realized how far away I really was from anyone else. If something happened, if anyone showed up, there'd be no one to hear me. I fell asleep, but not for long. At some point in the night, I woke up to the sound of crunching gravel outside the cabin. I froze in my bed, my ears straining. There weren't supposed to be people out here. I hadn't seen a single house or truck on the way in. The sound wasn't steady like footsteps. It was slow, deliberate, like someone stepping carefully just off the porch. I held my breath, hoping maybe it was just a deer wandering by. But then I heard the soft creak of one of the porch boards under weight. That sound turned my stomach cold because I knew exactly how those boards felt when I walked over them earlier. That wasn't an animal. I stayed perfectly still, staring toward the door in the dark. The lantern had burned out, and the only light came faintly from the moon outside the window. I thought about reaching for the hatchet I'd left leaning by the bed, but I didn't want to move. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever was out there could hear it. After a while, the sound stopped. I didn't know if the person had walked off or was just standing there, waiting. I didn't sleep again for the rest of the night. When daylight came, I finally stepped outside. The yard looked the same as before, but the dirt path leading up to the cabin showed fresh marks. I saw the shape of boots pressed into the ground, circling toward the porch, then leading back into the trees. Whoever it was hadn't been lost or wandering. They had come straight here. That day, I tried to distract myself by walking deeper into the woods, but no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My nerves were sharp, and I found myself turning around at the smallest noises. I went back to the cabin before dark and locked the door, even though the old lock wasn't much more than a metal latch. That night was worse. I stayed awake, waiting. Around midnight, the sounds returned. At first, just the faint crunch of movement in the brush, then the porch boards again. The door handle rattled once, quietly, like someone testing it. My throat felt dry, and I gripped the hatchet, sitting in the dark. Whoever it was didn't leave quickly this time. They moved slowly around the cabin, pausing at the windows. I could hear breathing through the glass at one point, low and steady, too close to mistake. Hours dragged before silence came again. When morning broke, I checked outside. More boot tracks, circling the cabin again and again. They weren't even trying to hide it. It felt like a game to them, and I was the piece they were moving around. I lasted one more night. I didn't sleep at all. Every branch crack, every brush of wind felt like someone was outside. I kept the hatchet in my hand until my wrist ached, my eyes burning from staying open too long. Around 3 a.m, I heard something different. The sound of something tapping against the window, slow and steady, like a finger knocking. It didn't stop for almost a full minute. That was enough. The first light, I threw everything back into my truck. I didn't care about leaving things behind. I just needed to get out of there. When I pulled onto the dirt road, I looked back once. The cabin sat there in the clearing, quiet and still, but I swear I saw movement at the tree-line. Someone standing just far enough back in the shadows to keep hidden. I didn't slow down. I drove until the trees opened up and the paved road reappeared, and I didn't stop until I was miles away. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't ask the owner any questions, didn't file a report, didn't tell anyone what had happened. The truth was simple. Someone knew I was alone out there, and they had decided to play with that fact. It wasn't a ghost or anything from a story. It was a person, flesh and blood, who wanted me to know I wasn't safe. That trip taught me something I've never forgotten. The woods can be silent, the nights long, and the distance from others can make you feel free. But all it takes is one person with the wrong intentions to turn that freedom into a trap. And when you're out there, far from anyone else, you learn quickly just how small and helpless you can feel. I hadn't driven down that old logging road in years, not since my divorce. My ex-husband's cabin sat a few miles past the turnoff, hidden between heavy rows of pine that seemed to close in tighter every year. I told myself I was only taking the road because the highway was jammed with construction, but deep down I knew there was another reason. I wanted to see it again, the place where I'd spent the hardest years of my life, and maybe remind myself why I had left. It was early fall in 2014, the air sharp but not yet cold enough to bite. I was 38 then, and life felt heavier than it used to. The sky was gray, carrying that dull look of late afternoons when the light sinks quicker than you expect. My tires crunched over the gravel as I eased off the main highway and into the woods. The road narrowed almost instantly, broken branches scattered across it, and the ruts deeper than I remembered. The cabin sat about 4 miles in, but the first 2 miles felt endless. The trees pressed in, taller now, shadows stretching even though it wasn't that late in the day. Every bump and scrape under the car made me tighten my grip on the wheel. I hadn't told anyone where I was going. That thought came sharp, as if my own mind was warning me. When I came around the bend that opened slightly, I caught the roofline through the trees. Brown shingles, edges curled, and moss crawling up the sides. The sight sent a strange jolt through me. I remembered painting that roof with him one summer, sweat running down our backs, his short temper boiling when the paint spilled. That was 15 years ago, when the place was more of a dream than a trap. I parked farther down, not wanting to pull into the old drive. The driveway itself was half swallowed by weeds and fallen branches. I killed the engine and just sat there for a while. The silence out here was thick. No wind, no voices, no hum of traffic. Just that heavy stillness that makes you notice your own breathing. I finally stepped out, the air damp, carrying the smell of wet pine and old earth. My boots sank into soft ground as I walked toward the cabin. The siding was faded and cracked, patches of green creeping up the lower boards. The front steps sagged. I could picture us sitting there years ago, drinking coffee, him watching me with that look he had, the one that always made me feel small. I told myself I'd just walk past it. No need to linger, but as I got closer, I noticed things that pulled me in. The door wasn't shut all the way. It hung slightly open, the frame warped. That wasn't how we left it. After the divorce, he stayed for a while, but when he moved out, the place was supposed to be locked. My chest tightened. I edged up to the steps, careful with the wood that creaked under my weight. The inside smelled faintly of mildew, stronger than it ever used to. I didn't step in right away, just leaned forward, peering through the gap. Dust floated in the stale air. The living room looked the same but older, more tired. The couch we once fought over sat slumped against the wall, cushions torn. The stone fireplace was blackened from years of use, ashes still scattered as if someone had left in a hurry. Against my better judgment, I pushed the door wider and stepped inside. My boots thudded on the warped boards. The kitchen to the right was cluttered, a few cans still sitting on the counter, rusted at the edges. I walked further, each step making the floor complain under me. The sound of dripping water hit my ears. I turned toward the back hallway. The bathroom door was open, and a slow leak from the sink tapped into a bucket someone had placed underneath. That meant somebody had been here recently. My skin prickled. I stood still, listening. Nothing moved. No shuffle, no crack. Just that steady drip. I glanced toward the back bedroom, the one we used to sleep in. The door was almost shut. My heart beat faster, every part of me wanting to leave but my legs still moving forward. I pushed the door with my fingertips. The room smelled musty, the air thick. The bed frame we built together leaned awkwardly, mattress sunken, sheets still tangled on it. But what froze me was the corner. There were fresh footprints in the dust, large ones, leading toward the closet. I stepped back quickly, pulse hammering, eyes locked on that closet door. It was slightly ajar. The space behind it was dark. My instinct screamed at me to leave. I turned, forcing myself down the hall, each breath shallow. At the front, I caught sight of something that made me stop again. On the table near the window sat a mug. Steam still curled faintly from it. My blood went cold. Someone was here. Not years ago, not weeks ago. Now, I didn't think anymore. I bolted out the front, stumbling over the steps, hitting the ground hard before scrambling toward my car. My ears strained for any sound behind me. Footsteps, a voice, the door creaking again. Nothing came, but I didn't dare look back. I shoved myself into the driver's seat, hands shaking as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared, far too loud in the silence, and I reversed hard, gravel spraying. My eyes caught the front of the cabin one last time as I turned. The door stood open wider than before. The drive out felt twice as long. Every shadow between the trees looked alive. Every bump in the road made me think someone was running after me. I didn't slow until the highway lights finally broke through the trees, and I merged back into the world of cars and movement and safety. I didn't stop driving until I was nearly 2 towns away. My hands still trembled when I finally pulled into a gas station and sat under the harsh glow of the lights. People walked around me, normal life carrying on, while I tried to steady my breath. I realized then how lucky I'd been. I had no idea who was inside that cabin. Squatters, drifters, or worse. Whoever it was, they weren't just passing through. They had made that place their own. If I had lingered even a few more minutes, opened that closet, or hesitated when I saw the mug, I might not have made it back out. That night, as I lay in bed at home, I thought about the years I spent in that cabin with my ex-husband. The fights, the silences, the feeling of being trapped. And I realized something. Walking away back then hadn't just saved me from him. It might have saved me from what that cabin would eventually become. A place where people vanish, swallowed by its quiet isolation. I never went back again. I never even took that road again. And I made sure to tell myself, if I ever felt that pull to see it one more time, to remember the door swinging open, the steam rising from that mug, and the footprints in the dust leading straight into the closet. That was enough reminder of the past I had already escaped. I was 34 years old the first time I decided to stay alone in the cabin with my dog. It was late October of 2012, just outside the edges of northern Michigan, where the forests stretch for miles and the nights drop into silence so thick it feels heavy in the air. I had bought the cabin a year before, a small wooden place tucked away off a narrow dirt road. It wasn't much, 2 rooms, a small loft, and a wood stove, but it felt like a little escape from the noise of my life. I had been divorced for 2 years, and I wanted quiet more than anything. My dog, Max, a 5-year-old German Shepherd, was the only company I had. He was always alert, the type of dog that picked up on every sound, every shift in the air. I trusted him more than I trusted myself when it came to sensing danger. The day had started calm. I arrived at the cabin around 4 in the afternoon. The sky was already turning gray, heavy clouds rolling in from the west. The dirt road was damp from a rain the night before, and I could hear the crunch of gravel under the tires as I pulled up. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered, dark wood blending into the trees that surrounded it. It always looked lonelier when I hadn't been there in a while. Inside, the air was stale. I opened a couple of windows to let the cold air in. Max sniffed around, tail up, as if checking every corner to make sure the place was safe. I stacked the wood I brought inside by the stove, lit a fire, and started settling in. The silence out there was different from the city. It wasn't just quiet. It was absolute, broken only by the distant rustle of leaves or the occasional snap of a branch. As night came on, the temperature dropped fast. I heated some canned soup on the stove and ate while Max curled up at my feet. The fire threw shadows across the walls, and I tried to relax, but I couldn't shake a faint unease. It wasn't anything obvious, just the way the trees outside seemed too still, the way the wind came in short, sharp gusts instead of steady flow. I told myself I was overthinking, that being alone in a remote cabin always came with nerves. Around 9, I took Max outside so he could stretch his legs before bed. The forest was darker than I had ever seen it. No moonlight slipping through the thick clouds. My flashlight beam barely cut into the black, and I could only see a few yards ahead. Max's ears stood tall, his body tense as he sniffed the air. He didn't growl, but he didn't move far from me either. That set me on edge. Normally, he darted ahead, chasing scents or rustling in the brush. We went back inside, and I locked the door. The cabin only had one main lock and an old sliding bolt near the top. It never felt like much, but it was all I had. I added more wood to the fire, and Max settled again, though his ears still flicked at every sound. I sat on the couch with a book, but I kept reading the same lines over and over. My mind wasn't on the words. It was on the silence pressing against the cabin walls. Around midnight, I finally decided to head to bed. I left the fire burning low, climbed up into the loft, and lay down on the thin mattress. Max refused to stay at the foot of the bed like he usually did. Instead, he sat upright near the top of the stairs, watching, listening. His posture was stiff, like he was waiting for something. I tried to ignore it, but my heart wouldn't settle. I don't know how long I had been lying there when Max let out a low growl. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to pull me fully awake. My eyes snapped open, and I could see the faint glow of the dying fire downstairs. I held my breath, listening. First, nothing. Then I heard it, a faint crunch outside, like someone stepping on the gravel near the cabin. I told myself it could have been a deer, or maybe even the wind knocking something loose. But then it came again. Slow, deliberate steps. Gravel, then a pause. Gravel again. My mouth went dry, and I could feel my pulse in my throat. Max growled again, louder this time, and then he barked sharply. He ran halfway down the loft stairs and stopped, staring at the front door. I eased out of bed, careful not to make noise, and reached for the small flashlight I kept near me. I didn't own a gun, but I had a heavy steel poker from the fireplace. I gripped it so tight my knuckles hurt. The steps stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then a different sound, the faint scrape of metal against the cabin door. My heart slammed hard in my chest. Someone was trying to force the lock. Max barked again, fierce and sharp, and threw his weight against the railing. His growls filled the cabin, but the scraping didn't stop right away. It dragged on for a few seconds, then silence again. I stood frozen, the flashlight shaking slightly in my hand. I didn't want to move, but I forced myself to creep down the loft stairs, Max at my side. I turned the flashlight toward the front door, and I could see the handle rattling, slow and quiet, as if someone was testing it from the other side. I felt sick. Whoever was out there wasn't lost, wasn't a hiker. Nobody wandered this far out by accident, not in the middle of the night. This was deliberate. Max's growling turned into frantic barking, loud and wild. I snapped the flashlight off, not wanting to give away where I was, and pressed my back against the wall. The handle rattled once more, then stopped. I waited, listening so hard it made my ears ring. Minutes crawled by. The only sound was Max's panting and the faint crackle of the fire. I thought maybe they had left, but then I heard it again. This time not at the door. It was at the back of the cabin. The faint crunch of footsteps moving slowly through the leaves, circling. My whole body went cold. Whoever it was, they weren't leaving. They were moving around, checking for another way in. I stayed pressed against the wall, gripping the poker, flashlight off, waiting. Max moved with me, muscles tense, eyes fixed on the sound. We stood like that for what felt like forever, listening as the steps faded toward the back, then silence again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I stayed awake, watching, listening, waiting for the steps to return. Max never relaxed, his head lifting at every crack outside. The fire burned down to embers, and the cabin sank into darkness. Every minute dragged like an hour. When the first gray light of morning finally crept through the windows, I felt like my body was lead. I unlocked the door and opened it slowly, Max rushing out ahead of me. The ground outside showed clear prints in the damp dirt, boot prints large, circling the cabin more than once. At the back window, I saw scratches along the frame, where someone had tried to pry it open with something metal. The realization hit me hard. Someone had been trying to get inside while I was sleeping. They hadn't been spooked by Max's barking, not fully. They had tested every way in patient, careful. The only thing that had stopped them was the locks holding and the dog making noise. I packed up my things fast, heart still racing. Max stayed close to me, his tail low, watching the trees. I loaded the truck and didn't look back at the cabin until I was halfway down the dirt road. That was the last night I ever stayed there alone. The cabin had once felt like a safe retreat, but after that night, I couldn't shake the memory of those footsteps circling in the dark, of the sound of someone scraping at the door while I stood there with nothing but a flashlight and a steel poker. Even now, years later, I still think about it when the nights are too quiet. That cabin taught me something I'll never forget. Sometimes the scariest thing in the dark isn't what you imagine, but the very real person you don't see, waiting just outside. It was the fall of 1998 when I got assigned to one of the loneliest ranger cabins I had ever seen. My name was Daniel, I was 34 back then, and I had already spent nearly 10 years working for the Park Service. I thought I knew what isolation felt like, but nothing prepared me for that cabin deep inside the northern edge of the Oregon wilderness. The cabin was meant for overnight stays when patrolling trails far from the main ranger station. It stood in a clearing of damp moss and pine needles, surrounded on all sides by thick trees that let in very little light, even in the daytime. The nearest road was miles away, and the trail leading in was narrow and covered with roots and rocks, barely fit for an ATV. The cabin itself was small, no more than a single room with a wood stove in one corner, a cot pushed up against the far wall, and shelves nailed into the rough boards for supplies. It had been built decades earlier and patched over the years, but it always looked like it was sagging a little, as if the forest was pulling it back into the ground. The smell inside was a mix of damp wood, smoke from old fires, and the faint sourness of mouse droppings. Every surface felt a little dusty or sticky from moisture. I arrived late in the afternoon after a long hike in. My duty was simple: check trail conditions, note signs of wildlife, and stay the night before continuing further in the next morning. I liked the work, even the solitude. I carried a pack with dried food, a lantern, extra clothes, and my old field notebook. I was used to the silence of the woods, the way the trees muffled everything, and the sense that the rest of the world had vanished. But that night, the silence didn't sit right with me. It had rained the day before, and the ground was still soft and spongy. I dropped my gear inside the cabin and stacked some logs by the stove. The sun was already dipping behind the ridgeline, leaving the clearing in shadow, and I could feel the air getting colder. I made a small fire in the stove, the crackle and warmth spreading through the one-room cabin. I boiled water for instant coffee and sat on the cot, writing notes in my log. The light from the lantern threw soft, shaky shadows on the walls. Outside, the forest seemed too still. Usually, I'd hear owls or small animals moving through the underbrush, but that night the woods pressed in with silence. Even the wind barely moved the branches. At first, I told myself I was just noticing it more because I was alone, but the quiet worked its way into my chest like a weight. After dark, I stepped outside to use the latrine and found fresh footprints in the mud just past the clearing. They weren't mine, and they weren't animal tracks either. They were boot prints, wide and heavy, like someone had been circling the cabin earlier. They sank deep into the wet soil, meaning whoever made them was big or carrying weight. I followed them for a few yards before the dark swallowed them up between the trees. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I hadn't seen another ranger or hiker all day, and no one had signed the trail register in weeks. Back inside, I barred the door with the wood plank kept for that purpose. I told myself it was probably an old hunter passing through before the season closed. Maybe someone who didn't want to run into park staff. But the way those tracks circled half the cabin made me uneasy. I checked my radio, but the signal barely worked this far out, just faint static when I tried to call in. I lay on the cot with my boots still on, listening to the stove ticking as it cooled down. Hours passed like that, my body heavy but my mind alert. Every creak of the old wood making me think someone was leaning against the walls outside. Around midnight, I heard it, the crunch of footsteps moving through the wet needles just beyond the cabin. Slow, steady, careful steps. Not an animal, not the wind. Person. I held my breath. The fire was low, the lantern dimmed, but enough light leaked through the cracks for anyone outside to know I was in there. The steps circled once, then stopped near the back wall. I sat frozen, my hand on the flashlight, listening so hard my ears rang. For a long time, nothing happened. Then a soft scrape, like a boot shifting against wood. Whoever it was, they were standing just feet away from me, on the other side of the wall. I didn't sleep after that. I sat up, staring at the door, the barred plank, and the tiny window. My heart thudded in my chest so loud it felt like the whole forest could hear it. Hours dragged on, and eventually the silence returned. When the faint gray of dawn began to leak through the trees, I finally stepped outside. The ground behind the cabin was torn up with footprints, dozens of them. Whoever had been out there had walked back and forth all night, pacing the tree line, circling close and then stepping back. In some spots, the mud showed deep impressions where someone had just stood still for long stretches, facing the cabin. There were no signs they'd built a fire or set up camp. No wrappers, no dropped gear, just boots in the mud and the heavy, quiet woods. I packed my gear quickly, my hands shaking as I shoved things into my bag. I left the cabin cleaner than I found it, out of habit, but I didn't bother eating breakfast. On the hike back, every snapped twig made me spin around, expecting to see someone behind me. But the trail was empty, the forest still. By the time I reached the ranger station that afternoon, my nerves were shot. I filed my report, mentioned the footprints and the pacing, but I didn't write down how it really felt. Like I had been watched all night by someone who had no reason to be out there. The others shrugged it off. Hunters, they said. Maybe someone lost, maybe squatters. Out here, you see strange things. But I know what I saw. That night in the cabin, whoever was out there never tried the door, never broke a window, never left a message. They just circled, slow and patient, as if waiting for me to step outside, as if testing how long I could sit there, alone in the dark. I never volunteered for that cabin again. Even years later, when I passed that trail on patrol, I felt my chest tighten. The trees still closed in around that clearing. The moss still soaked up every sound, and the old cabin still sagged like it was sinking into the ground. But I never set foot inside it again, because some things aren't just about what you see. They're about what waits outside, silent, patient, letting you know the woods don't belong to you at all. I was 27 when I found myself driving through the back roads of northern Michigan in the fall of 1996. I had taken a week off from work, hoping to get some time away from everything. I had packed only a sleeping bag, a small tent, some canned food, and a lantern. My plan was simple: to hike, camp, and clear my head. The weather was cool but not freezing yet, and the forest was thick with reds, oranges, and browns from the changing leaves. On the third day of my trip, I had wandered farther than I expected. I followed a narrow trail that eventually faded into nothing but patches of flattened grass and broken branches. I didn't care. I had enough gear in my backpack to make a camp anywhere. But what stopped me was something I didn't expect to see. An old cabin, sitting half hidden between tall pines and thick brush. It looked forgotten. The wood was dark with rot, and the roof sagged under years of weather. The small porch was tilted, and weeds had crawled up its sides like fingers. One of the windows had a board nailed across it, but the rest were just empty holes with bits of broken glass clinging to the frames. The door hung slightly open, creaking every so often when the breeze picked up. I stood there staring at it, trying to figure out why it felt so out of place. I hadn't seen a single house or cabin in miles. There weren't even signs of hunting camps nearby. Something about it made me feel uneasy, but curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to look inside. I pushed the door open slowly. The hinges groaned, and the smell hit me. Stale wood mold, and something else, sharp and metallic, like rust. The floor was warped and soft in places, covered with old leaves and dirt. There was a table in the center, its legs uneven and split, with a layer of dust so thick I could write in it with my finger. A chair lay on its side nearby, broken in half like someone had kicked it. In the corner, there was a small stove, its black iron covered in rust. Next to it, a stack of rotting firewood sat in a box that had collapsed in on itself. The walls had shelves, but most of them were empty except for a few jars with something dark and unrecognizable inside. The place had been abandoned for decades at least. I walked further in, careful where I stepped. The back wall had a doorway that led to what looked like a single bedroom. Inside, there was an old mattress slumped on a broken frame, its stuffing spilling out. A pair of boots sat beside it, cracked and stiff like they'd been there for years. I should have left right then, but I didn't. Something about the cabin made me want to study it, like it held a story. I set my pack down on the porch and decided I'd camp nearby for the night. It wasn't smart. I knew that, but the thought of sleeping in the woods again when I had some sort of shelter in front of me seemed easier. As the sun dropped lower, the forest went quiet. I set up my small lantern inside the cabin on the table, giving the place a dim yellow glow. The silence pressed down heavy, broken only by the occasional creak of wood as the cabin shifted in the cooling night air. I heated a can of beans on the little camping stove I had brought and ate in silence. The shadows stretched long across the floor, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though I knew it was impossible. When it was fully dark, I unrolled my sleeping bag on the floor of the bedroom, away from the broken windows. I tried to relax, but I couldn't. Every sound outside made me tense. The snapping of branches, the scratching of leaves against the wood. At one point, I swore I heard footsteps just outside the cabin. Not an animal scurrying, but slow, heavy steps. I froze in my bag, barely breathing. The lantern flickered, casting shifting shapes on the wall. My heart pounded so hard I thought I'd make a noise just from that. After a long minute, the sound faded. I told myself it was deer moving through the brush, but it didn't sound like deer. It sounded deliberate. I didn't sleep much. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke to a faint scraping sound. It was close, too close. I reached for my lantern and turned it up just enough to see. There were fresh marks on the wooden floor near the door, long scratches that hadn't been there before. I stared at them, trying to understand. They weren't from claws or shoes. They looked like something heavy had been dragged. The air inside felt colder, sharper. My throat was dry. I packed up my bag quietly, moving slowly so the boards wouldn't creak too much. I didn't want to stay there another second. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that maybe I just hadn't noticed the marks before. But deep down, I knew I had. When I stepped outside, the night was still and heavy. The moon lit the clearing faintly, enough to see the trees swaying. My breath came out in small clouds. I grabbed my pack and started down the way I thought I had come. The trail wasn't clear, and soon I realized I had gotten turned around. Every direction looked the same, and the cabin stayed behind me like a dark shadow no matter which way I glanced back. I walked for what felt like hours until I found the faint line of the trail again. My legs ached, and my hands were stiff from gripping my flashlight so hard. I didn't stop until the first light of morning began to show through the trees. Only then did I sit down, exhausted, and eat a cold granola bar. When the sun was fully up, I finally looked at the map I had packed. I realized something that chilled me worse than the night had. That cabin wasn't marked anywhere. There were no signs of structures for miles in any direction. It was as if it wasn't supposed to exist. I kept hiking until I made it back to my car that afternoon. I didn't look back, didn't try to figure out where I had gone wrong on the trail. I just left. Weeks later, back at home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I tried asking around about old hunting cabins or shacks in that area, but no one I spoke to knew anything. One old man at a gas station told me the land out there had been logged heavily in the early 1900s, and some cabins were built for workers, but most had burned down or collapsed long ago. The one I found shouldn't have still been standing, but it was. And what unsettled me more than anything was the feeling I had while lying on that rotten floor. The feeling that I hadn't been alone. I never went back. I never even tried. That stretch of forest is still there, and maybe the cabin is too. But I don't want to know. All I know is that I spent one night in it, and that was more than enough. I had always wanted a quiet place where I could be alone for a while, somewhere far from noise and people. In 1996, I drove out from Kansas City into the wooded hills of southern Missouri. I wasn't young anymore, 41 years old at the time, tired of city life, tired of hearing cars and sirens outside my window every night. My uncle had passed away the year before and left behind a small cabin near Mark Twain National Forest. It wasn't much, just one room with a small kitchen, a wood stove, and a porch that sagged when I walked on it. The cabin sat about a mile off a gravel road, hidden between trees thick enough to keep most of the daylight out. When I first arrived, the air smelled sharp with pine and damp earth. The ground was soft from a rain the night before, and my boots sank a little into the mud as I unloaded boxes from the truck. The cabin looked older than I remembered from visiting it as a teenager. The roof shingles curled like dead leaves, and the windows carried a film of grime on the glass. But it was solid enough. It had always been. The first few nights were calm. I kept the windows open to let the air flow through, listen to crickets and the wind push against the trees. During the day, I went walking through the woods with a small backpack, following deer trails and marking my path with bits of cloth so I wouldn't lose my way. The forest stretched for miles, a wide, quiet place where the only sounds came from birds, squirrels, and the occasional distant howl of a coyote. By the fifth night, something started to feel off. It wasn't anything I saw, but more of what I heard or didn't hear. Around midnight, the forest outside would go silent, all at once. No crickets, no frogs, no wind moving the branches. Just nothing. I sat up in bed and waited for the sounds to come back, but they didn't until an hour or two later. It made my chest feel tight, like I was being watched. I told myself it was only in my head. City people like me weren't used to that kind of silence. Still, I started double-checking the locks on the doors and windows each night. One morning, I walked out back to the small clearing behind the cabin. My uncle had built a chopping block there years ago. As I stepped into the clearing, I noticed footprints in the mud. They weren't mine. My boots were wider, flatter. These prints were narrow, deep, like someone had walked barefoot through the wet ground. I bent down and touched one. It was fresh. The edges hadn't collapsed or dried out yet. I didn't like that. That night, I pushed the couch against the front door. I sat awake with my uncle's old hunting rifle across my lap. I told myself I wouldn't use it unless I had to, but my hands shook every time the cabin popped or creaked. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. I found more signs, broken twigs, mud tracked up near the sidewall, a dent in the soft ground near the porch, like someone had stood there a long time, looking in through the window. My stomach twisted when I realized that window looked right into where I slept. I wanted to leave, but stubbornness kept me there. I told myself it was probably kids messing around. There were a few scattered farms miles out, but I hadn't seen anyone nearby since I arrived. Still, I didn't want to pack up and run. This place had been left to me, and I wasn't about to give it up after a week. On the seventh night, I was woken up by something faint, something that didn't sound like the woods. I lay still in bed, my ears straining. It was breathing, not mine. Slow, steady breathing just outside the wall near my headboard. I froze, staring at the ceiling, barely letting my chest move. The breathing went on for what felt like forever. Then it stopped. I waited, gripping the rifle so hard my knuckles ached. When the sun came up, I walked around to that side of the cabin. The dirt under the window was flattened, like someone had been lying there on their stomach. That broke me down. I packed up some things in the truck and decided I would at least spend the night in town. But before I left, I wanted to check the small storage shed about 50 yards behind the cabin. My uncle had always kept tools and spare parts in there, and I thought maybe I'd take some things with me. The shed door was locked with an old padlock. I broke it open with a hammer. Inside, the air smelled stale like rust and old oil. Tools hung on the wall, a workbench lined with nails and scraps of wood. I almost left right away, but then I noticed the floorboards in the corner looked different, newer. They didn't match the rest. I knelt down and pried one loose. Underneath, there was a space hollowed into the dirt. At first, I thought it was some kind of storage pit. Then I saw what was inside, a pile of clothes, dirty and torn, pressed down into the earth. Beside them, a cracked leather belt, a filthy blanket, and something that made my stomach lurch so hard I nearly fell backward. A human shoe, small, like it belonged to a teenager. It was caked in dried mud. I didn't dig deeper. I didn't want to. My chest hammered, and the back of my neck went cold. I dropped the board back over the hole, grabbed my things, and ran out of there. I drove straight into the nearest town, a place called Mountain View, and went straight to the sheriff's office. I told them everything about the footprints, the breathing, the window, the shed. They didn't laugh. A deputy drove back with me to the cabin that afternoon. They spent hours there, digging out that hole in the shed. I waited by the truck while they worked. I couldn't hear what they said, but I saw them pulling things out, bagging them, marking the ground. By evening, the sheriff came over to me, his face stiff and hard. He told me they had found remains, bones, more than one set. Whoever had been using that shed had been doing it for a long time. He didn't go into details, and I didn't ask. I just told him I wasn't staying another night out there. I left the cabin that same day. I never went back, not even to collect the rest of my things. I signed papers later on, giving the property up to the county. To this day, I don't know who it was out there watching me. Maybe they were the one who left those remains. Maybe someone else had been using that place before me, and I had simply shown up at the wrong time. All I know is, if I had stayed another night, I don't think I'd be here to tell this. I still remember the trip like it happened last night, even though years have passed. It was the summer of 1998, and I had just turned 30. I had been working long shifts in the city, hardly sleeping, eating cheap takeout food, and staring at office walls all day. My uncle owned a small cabin in the upper woods of northern Michigan, about 5 miles off a dirt road that itself felt like it was forgotten. He told me I could use it whenever I needed a break. The place was built in the early 70s, nothing fancy, just 4 walls of timber, a sloped tin roof, and a porch that leaned slightly to one side. It had one main room with a small wood stove, a short hallway, and 2 rooms in the back that were barely big enough for a bed and dresser. The bathroom was more of an afterthought, a closet with plumbing. My uncle never upgraded it much. That was fine for me. I wanted peace, quiet, and distance from everything. The drive out there was long. The pavement ended miles before the property, and the gravel road that followed twisted through thick pine and birch woods. By the time I got to the path that led directly to the cabin, it was already evening, the light dimming behind the trees. The path was narrow, with tall grass brushing the sides of my truck. I had to push it harder than I liked because the ground was soft from a week of rain. I could smell the dampness through the open window, that earthy, almost sour smell of soaked leaves and mud. When I finally parked by the porch, I cut the engine and just sat there for a moment. It was completely silent. No highway noise, no voices, not even the buzz of power lines. Just a faint trickle of water somewhere deep in the woods, maybe a stream. Inside, the air was stale, the kind that builds up when a place has been closed too long. Dust clung to the furniture, and the floor creaked under every step. I unpacked slowly, setting a duffel bag on the bed and stacking a few groceries I had brought into the small kitchen area. By the time I lit the lantern on the table, the woods outside had already gone black. The first night was calm enough, though I didn't sleep well. The rain started again just after midnight. It drummed against the tin roof in steady sheets, and every now and then a gust of wind made the cabin groan. I lay awake listening, trying to adjust to the isolation. The next morning, I decided to walk the property. The grass around the cabin reached almost to my waist, and there were old tire ruts cutting through, half swallowed by weeds. The woods pressed close on every side. After an hour of walking, I found an old shed about 200 yards back, half collapsed under its own weight. The door was gone, and inside were broken tools, rusted cans, and piles of leaves blown in by years of storms. I spent the day cutting firewood and cleaning. I wanted to settle in, but something about the place kept me restless. The silence felt heavy, and every time I looked at the edge of the trees, it felt like the woods were leaning closer. I told myself it was just the adjustment from city life. That night, the real unease started. I woke up around 2 in the morning to a sound outside. It wasn't the rain this time. It had stopped earlier in the evening. What I heard was a crunch, like boots pressing into wet soil. At first I froze, holding my breath, waiting. Then it came again, slow steps circling. I stayed still, straining my ears. My uncle had warned me about animals, black bears, coyotes, sometimes even stray dogs. But the sound wasn't the shuffle of paws. It was deliberate, paced, and it moved around the cabin in a wide arc. I slid out of bed and kept low, the boards groaning under me. I peeked through the small window but saw nothing, just the faint outline of trees under the moonlight. The steps stopped. I stood there, barely breathing, until finally I told myself it had to be my imagination. Maybe the trees creaking or water dripping from the roof. In the morning, though, I checked the ground. The soil was soft, and near the porch steps, I saw clear impressions. Not boots exactly, but shoes, the tread worn almost smooth. They led from the tree line, circled the cabin, and disappeared back into the grass. I didn't know what to think. There weren't supposed to be people out here. Nearest neighbor was 6 miles away, across a ridge. I kept telling myself maybe it was a hunter or someone lost. Still, the prints bothered me. I tried to brush it off, but the thought stayed stuck in my head all day. By the third night, I was exhausted. I tried to read by lantern, but every small sound outside pulled my attention. When I finally fell asleep, I woke again around the same time. This time, it wasn't footsteps. It was the sound of the back door handle, a faint rattle, like someone testing it. I froze in bed, heart pounding so hard it felt like the whole room could hear it. The handle rattled once more, then stopped. I stayed awake until dawn, sitting in a chair with the fire poker in my lap, staring at the door. When the light came, I checked the handle. Scratches ran along the metal, fresh ones. Whoever had tried it didn't care if I noticed. That morning, I decided I wasn't going to wait around. I packed my things fast and hauled them to the truck. When I stepped off the porch, I caught something in the grass. A single can of food from my groceries, half opened and left sitting by the steps. I hadn't touched it. Driving back down that narrow path, I kept checking the mirror. The trees seemed endless, crowding in on both sides. My chest didn't loosen until I reached the main gravel road and saw the wide, empty stretch ahead. Later, when I told my uncle, he just nodded. He said sometimes people camp in those woods, squatters who know how to stay hidden. They move through abandoned properties, take what they can, watch from the trees. He didn't seem surprised at all. I thought about the footsteps, the rattling handle, the scratched metal. Whoever it was hadn't come for food right away. They circled, watched, and tested. They waited until the second night to touch the door. And when I left, they left that can behind, almost like a message. I never went back to that cabin. Even now, whenever I hear rain on a roof at night, my mind drags me back there. Sitting awake with that fire poker in my lap, listening to someone walk slow circles in the dark. The rain had started earlier in the evening, a steady drizzle that carried a damp chill into everything it touched. I had been working all day on a small plot of land I had bought in the hills of northern Vermont back in 2004. I was 32 then, restless and tired of apartment life, desperate for a place that was quiet, far from neighbors, where I could put my hands into something solid. The plan was simple: build a small cabin from the ground up. Nothing fancy, just 4 walls, a roof, and enough insulation to make it livable. That night, though, the weather made everything harder. The ground was soft from weeks of autumn rain, and the slope where I'd picked to lay the base was muddy, pulling at my boots with every step. My hands were raw from lifting beams and hammering in the wet, and the constant drip of water off my hood kept me tense. I had no company out there, just a gas lantern, a headlamp strapped around my forehead, and the hammering of the rain on the forest around me. The spot I'd chosen sat about an hour off the nearest road, a dirt track you couldn't drive on without a truck. I had hauled all my supplies in by hand over the past week: lumber, nails, tools, tarps, food, and water. I thought I was being smart, building away from everything, tucked deep into the woods where I wouldn't be disturbed. But as the rain picked up that night, the silence of the place turned into something heavier, something that pressed against me from every direction. I was halfway through raising the frame for one of the walls. My gloves were slick with water and mud, and every strike of the hammer echoed far louder than it should have. It was strange how the forest amplified sounds when the rain came down. Sometimes it sounded like movement out there, branches breaking, leaves shifting, the squelch of boots in mud. I kept pausing, lifting my headlamp toward the tree-line, trying to convince myself it was just water knocking loose deadfall. The lantern cast a weak glow across the beams, and the shadows seemed to bend and move. I told myself not to think about it. I needed the wall up before I could stretch the tarp across the top for shelter. The air was colder by the minute, and the rain had started to soak through my jacket. My body shook from exhaustion, but stopping meant shivering harder. So I kept working one nail at a time. At some point, I noticed footprints in the mud, just outside the cleared spot where I was building. At first, I figured they were mine, but when I looked closely, I realized they weren't. They were smaller, narrower, and the direction of them didn't match the way I had walked. They cut across the edge of the site, looping back toward the woods. I stared at them under the headlamp beam, trying to think of another explanation. Maybe a hiker, though no one came this far out without a reason. Maybe an old print, washed into clarity by the rain. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't been there earlier in the day. The rain fell harder. The lantern hissed as drops hit the glass, threatening to blow it out. I kept hammering, but my ears strained against the sound of water. Every so often, I thought I heard something, like someone breathing or the low crunch of wet leaves under careful steps. Each time I froze, listening, the noise would fade. By midnight, The frame was finally upright, and I stretched the tarp across it for a temporary roof. My back ached so badly I could barely stand straight. I dropped onto a log, pulled out a thermos, and drank lukewarm coffee while staring at the half-finished shape of the cabin. The lantern light flickered, and for a second I thought I saw movement between the trees again, a dark outline against the shifting rain. But when I blinked, it was gone. I forced myself to ignore it. I pulled the tarp tighter, drove in a few more nails to hold it against the wind, then set up my sleeping bag on the driest patch of ground I could find under the cover. The rain hammered above me like a drum. I lay there for hours listening. My mind wouldn't rest. Every sound carried meaning. A branch snapping wasn't just a branch snapping. It was a footstep. A faint knock against the lumber wasn't just the wind. It was someone brushing past the wall. At some point, exhaustion won and I dozed off. But I woke in the pitch black sometime before dawn. The lantern had gone out. The rain had slowed to a mist, and the forest was quiet in a way that made my stomach tighten. That was when I heard it, wood shifting, deliberate, right outside the tarp. The slow creak of weight against the beams I had set up. I froze, holding my breath. The sound came again. Something was testing the frame of the cabin. Not the wind. There was rhythm in it, pressure that bent the wood. My heart pounded so loud I thought it might give me away. I stayed as still as I could, every muscle locked, barely breathing. The sound went on for a minute or two, then stopped. I didn't move until daylight finally pushed into the trees. When I stepped outside, the first thing I saw was that one of the beams had shifted, as if something had pressed hard against it during the night. The mud around it was torn, as though boots had sunk deep into the ground right beside where I had slept. The prints were fresh, sharp around the edges, pointing straight toward the treeline. I packed my things in silence, every movement heavy. The hammer, nails, thermos, tarp, all of it back into the pack. I didn't bother dismantling the frame. I didn't even look back once I had everything strapped down. I just started walking the mile-long trail back to the dirt road, boots squelching in the mud. The whole time, I felt the weight of the woods pressing in, the silence broken only by my own steps. I didn't stop, didn't turn my headlamp back on even when I moved under the thickest parts of the canopy where the morning light barely reached. My only thought was to put distance between me and that unfinished cabin. By the time I reached the truck, I was soaked to the bone again. I threw the pack into the bed, climbed inside, and started the engine with shaking hands. The drive back down the dirt road was slow, the tires slipping in the muck, but I didn't care. I didn't look in the mirror, didn't let myself glance into the trees. I never went back to that spot. The supplies, the lumber, the half-built cabin, I left it all behind. Maybe someone else found it years later, maybe the forest swallowed it whole. But I learned something in those woods on that rainy night. It doesn't take ghosts or stories to scare you out of a place. Sometimes all it takes is the simple knowledge that you are not as alone as you thought you were. And for me, that was enough to keep me from ever trying to build a home in the woods again.